Good afternoon. I'm Daun Jung, a research fellow at the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore. Thank you so much for joining the webinar on offshore carbon capture and sequestration prospects and challenges, co-organized by NUS Center for International Law and Innovation Norway. I would like to briefly introduce you to the housekeeping rules. First, today's webinar will be recorded to be available on CIL website later on. And second, if you have any questions for the presenters, please use the Q&A feature in this Zoom. We will be able to answer them after the presentations. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Nilofer Orar, the Director of the NUS Center for International Law, for welcoming remarks.
Thank you so much, Dawoon. As Director of the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore, it is my great pleasure to extend my warmest greetings and welcome to all of you joining us to this webinar. I also take this opportunity to welcome our panel of experts and, of course, our moderator. Well, very short, I will make a very short welcome comment, but I have to say we are faced with a major challenge in climate change, and that is to reduce our consumption patterns of greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, in order to achieve the net zero goal and the Paris Agreement temperature target of 1.5 degrees centigrade. That is, of course, a reduction in the increase in time. But we don't have a lot of time. So while we look to mitigate greenhouse gases through various means, alternative energies, changing our living habits, in reality, we are still a long way from the goal post. So we need to examine alternative means to reduce our greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide. So carbon capture and sequestration is one of these measures. And today, specifically, our panel of experts will be talking about offshore carbon capture and sequestration. So I take this opportunity as I end my welcome comments to also thank those who have been involved in the organization of this event. And I wish you all an excellent session today with plenty of discussion, I hope. Thank you. Thank you, Dawoon.
Thank you, Nilofer. Now, let's please welcome our moderator, Daniel Yu, lead of the Climate Change Law and Policy Team at the NUS Center for International Law. Daniel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dawoon, and a good day, good afternoon, good evening to a wonderful panel of panelists and participants who are dialing in to this very important topic today, as Nilofer has mentioned. The panelists today will be speaking to different aspects of offshore CCS. And just to have a short introduction that, after the respective remarks, I look forward to a very engaging dialogue with the panelists and also with the questions from the various viewers. Now, first off, it's my pleasure to invite Matthias Honegger to speak to us. Matthias is a senior consultant and a senior research associate with Perspectives Climate Group, where he leads the team working on this very important issue of carbon dioxide removal. Matthias has a decade of experience working on other climate policy topics, including carbon markets, sectoral mitigation policies, national mitigation targets, etc., etc. So a renowned expert as well in this area of governance and science of solar radiation modification and the SDG goals. So his full bio is available on the link. Let me first invite Matthias to speak to us before I move on to the other speakers. Matthias, over to you, please.
Thank you, and your very kind introduction. So it is a pleasure to speak to you today a little bit about how the IPCC views CCS and has viewed CCS in the past, and also the placement of CCS in the climate regime within the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Climate Convention. And then I'll also briefly point to the carbon markets as one place where over the coming years, I believe there will be quite a bit of developments in terms of mobilizing CCS, both onshore and offshore. So with that, I will just dive in right away and again point to the IPCC as our main source of scientific insight into different mitigation options and how has the IPCC addressed CCS. So first of all, what's really important to note is that CCS is not a new topic. So already in 2005, 2006, the IPCC came out with a special report on CCS, both offshore and onshore. And it already then really highlighted the relevance of capturing and storing CO2, alongside obviously many other measures to cut emissions and ultimately to remove CO2 from the air. And since the assessment reports that came out every 4 years from the IPCC have been really consistent in highlighting that there's really a need for CCS already built into the common scenarios that the IPCC projects in terms of how we as a global society may deal with climate change, may attenuate climate change. And so CCS has consistently played a very important role on the order of several billion tons of CO2 that have to be captured and stored. And more recently, the scenarios have also explicitly included CO2 removal as a type of climate change mitigation. And this can be achieved, among other approaches, by combining the use of biomass with carbon capture and storage, because essentially the idea here is biomass is essentially a form of CO2 that has been captured from the air, from the atmosphere through the growth of plants, and sort of embodies that CO2. And when we transform biomass into, well, for use of energy or simply for waste treatment reasons, and we capture the CO2, well, ultimately we have then permanently taken away CO2 from the atmosphere. So this is a very prominent sort of CO2 removal form, but there are others that are being discussed. Another one is this direct air capture. So basically using thermal chemical process to sort of filter the air from CO2, and has gained a lot of attention in recent years. Now, this is obviously a very young technology. It's not, been scaled yet, and it takes a lot of energy to do that. But it is one that is also increasingly featured also in those scenarios. And the expectations are that this might scale gradually over the coming years, and especially the carbon markets, the voluntary buyers have paid a lot of attention to this, because it does not require the biomass that the BECCS form of CO2 removal would use. Now, the focus on CCS has, I would argue, almost grown over the years, in that we have really, as pointed out earlier, we have not really followed the path of emissions reductions that were projected earlier on, and we're still emitting way too much. So the focus on industry decarbonization, for example, in the production of cement and steel, but also in the chemical sectors, has really gained relevance, even though the real world action has lagged behind. And again, CCS for removal of CO2 from the air, especially in context of the 1.5 degree pathway, is really quite staggering what the needs are. So we're really looking at billions of tons that need to be removed. So these are cumulative numbers, those 30 to 780 gigatons of CO2, and you see it's a huge range, and that range is due to varying assumptions of what else we are doing. But clearly there are billions of tons that cumulatively will need to be removed from the air by 2100 if we want to and really try to stick with the 1.5 degree pathways. Of course, it looks a bit less extreme when we look at the various 2 degree pathways, but still there is going to be a need for CCS also to remove CO2 from the air that's already out there in the atmosphere. And so the IPCC also speaks a little bit on the levels of maturity. And so subsurface storage is basically something that the oil and gas sector knows a lot about, and is actually a very mature practice there. And of the something like, I think on the order of 35 installations across the world, most of those are actually for oil and gas recovery presently, because of a lack of incentives from other sources, from policies or carbon markets. But still, there is already quite a bit of experience, both offshore and onshore, in storing CO2 underground. Capture is a bit of a different story insofar that the different sectors pose varying challenges in terms of the levels of purity of flue gases, requiring in some cases more cleaning sort of modules that are really making sure that there's not too much other pollutants in the flue gas, which would otherwise harm the infrastructure that follows after the capture. So each of those industries has its own challenges and will need to sort of gradually learn and gain access to various sort of modules that then can be combined in order to ultimately produce a functioning value chain of capture, transport, and storage. So there's more of a learning curve ahead still in those sectors, but nonetheless, the basic technology is really there, and it can be used today. And also a word on the technical storage capacity, which is really estimated largely sufficient for storing all the CO2 that the scenarios are projecting that need to be stored somehow. So we're not really concerned about storage in that sense, but of course, the ultimate feasibility lies in the political processes that lead to permitting and actual implementation of storage sites. And there, of course, progress has been much slower, but also the incentivization has been much slower, which is why I'll talk briefly about carbon markets. So a word on the sort of legal nature of CCS. Of course, when we talk about climate action, we talk about often primarily about climate change mitigation. And so this word, climate change mitigation, really encompasses actions where CCS has an important role to play. And again, for two main outcomes. One is the reduction in emissions by capturing CO2 before they're released into the atmosphere. In case of refineries, fossil power plants, fossil waste incineration, cement production, or chemical industrial production, and other forms of industrial production that produce CO2 at a point source. So capturing that CO2 and storing it leads to emissions reductions. And as mentioned earlier, carbon dioxide removal is achieved in those cases where the source of the carbon is actually either biogenic, so from biomass, or directly from the atmosphere, so direct air capture from the atmosphere. And in the case of biomass, again, there's many different types of processes and sectors that could be involved, as is the case with biomass waste incineration, for example. I would argue that's one of the lowest hanging fruits to approach for governments, but also biomass power plants or combined heat and power plants, as well as any other biomass conversion processes, for example, in biofuel production. And it was quite interesting, even a few years ago, many climate policy experts were quite confused about the legal nature of carbon dioxide removal because it was sort of branded as a geoengineering type of activity. But it is clear, having taken a closer look at the legal language of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, it is clear that also carbon dioxide removal, so removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, is a form of climate change mitigation. And people get still confused sometimes, but I think it's important to point this out, because that also means that all the provisions that are in place for governments and private sector actors pertaining to climate change mitigation also pertain to removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. And so just to be very specific, because then also there's one needs to look closely to make the distinction between emissions reductions and removals. Removal is achieved only when the overall balance of all greenhouse gas flows involved in a certain activity between the atmosphere and the storage site is actually overall negative, right? So if you have really a flow of CO2 net from the atmosphere into permanent storage, and that can be assessed through life cycle assessment. And so for this to be the case, the necessary condition is that carbon is captured from the air or from a biogenic source. Now, in the Paris Agreement, there are provisions for cooperation between countries for achieving their nationally determined mitigation contributions, and that's in the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. That gives some guidance on how this could work. And there are two types of those cooperations. One is through more of a bilateral exchange between two countries that enter into agreement to trade emissions reductions or removals outcomes. And then there's the more centralized mechanism under Article 6.4, which is somewhat following the example of the previous instrument under the Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Development Mechanism, which has much more centralized oversight and more consistent rules applied to all parties in the world. And it is important to note, though, that it has been a while since the Paris Agreement was adopted, and still the operationalization is ongoing. So this is a very slow process, but it is gradually maturing and becoming a ready marketplace for incentivizing also CCS activities on the international scale. And especially with regard to removals, but storage overall, the committee of the market mechanism 6.4 is developing particular rules. They will probably follow quite a bit the example that the voluntary carbon markets are setting though. So it's interesting to look at that because that's where I think right now we have the most action in terms of moving towards incentivization of CCS activities. And so the voluntary carbon markets are a really important incubator for novel practices. And to date, unfortunately, CCS has really not featured among carbon market projects so far. And that's, among other reasons, perhaps due to relatively limited price levels, although there are different niches in those carbon markets. Some are much more high priced. But perhaps simply the attention to the need for CCS has been very low among voluntary carbon market buyers. But I think this is changing. And one condition for CCS to become really a central pillar of voluntary carbon markets is the existence of methodologies that quantify how much CO2 has actually been captured and stored. And this might seem obvious from a sort of technical standpoint if you look at the actual projects, but in terms of making this in a consistent and transparent manner, the voluntary carbon markets have very specific sort of notions of how to do this. And so there need to be in place those methodologies which outline exactly what needs to be monitored, what needs to be reported, and who is verifying that these results are actually achieved. And so there's a new initiative of which my colleagues are a part of, are actively working on, the CCS Plus initiative. Others are also working on this in the voluntary carbon market space, but I know this initiative best because I can talk to my colleagues and get a sense of where things are at. So the objectives of this initiative are exactly to mobilize to unlock the carbon markets for CCS, first in the voluntary carbon markets, but then gradually also the compliance markets, Article 6, and perhaps also emissions trading systems. And the aim is, of course, to do that in such a way that there is really a well-founded level of trust. So it is absolutely crucial, and we put a lot of effort into this to make sure that there is high integrity in the methodological framework, that it is transparent, and that it is clear how the different elements, different capture types, transport types, and storage types are combined in a consistent manner to show the overall result. And that also includes carbon capture and utilization, but of course, I think the overwhelming volume will be for storage underground and offshore. And yeah, so that's the aim, to really produce a broad umbrella and a broad and consistent tool set for monitoring and reporting and verifying the results of CCS related mitigation activities. And so this is really essential part of the overall carbon crediting cycle, which is the process, essentially the formal step-by-step process of generating carbon credits from a project. Every new project type, and this is generally the same sort of structure across different carbon markets, every new project type has to undergo this cycle, and every new project has to sort of follow these steps in order to really demonstrate the results in a consistent manner, to afterwards being able to sell credits on the market. And yeah, so with that, I think I will leave you with this, so we have later on perhaps the possibility to discuss some of the
Thanks very much,
details.
Matthias. Thanks very much, Matthias. A very, very succinct, but also very helpful and very comprehensive overview of the key questions that we need to grapple with. What is the treatment of CCS by the IPCC within the climate change UNFCCC climate regime? And then, of course, the last point that you raised is a very important practical question as well, in terms of the methodologies for monitoring, reporting, and verifying CCS. So thank you very much for that, Matthias. Now, with that kind of a legal policy background in mind, I'd like to turn to Cindy Kacherman, our second panelist, to address us on the technical aspects of how offshore CCS actually operates in practice. Now, Cindy is well placed to speak to this. She is a development planner on low carbon solution with ExxonMobil. She has been with ExxonMobil for over 15 years, having held various roles in commercial reservoir engineering, as well as business planning and analysis. And her current role supports the ExxonMobil's low carbon solutions in Asia Pacific. Over to you, Cindy.
Thank you, Danielle. So I'm trying to share my screen here.
Yes, Cindy, we can see your slides.
Okay, thank you. Right, so I think Matthias already talked about kind of the role of CCS. So I'll touch just a little bit on that. This first slide is really about the challenge ahead of us in terms of GHG emissions around the world. Right, we have about 35 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions, and these are the different paths under the IEA, International Energy Agency scenarios on how we can get to different paths by 2050, right? And in all of these, in any of these scenarios, CCS plays a key role in that decarbonization. So again, Matthias touched a little bit on this about the industry emissions, but not all are the same or similar, right? So some emission sources are just harder to decarbonize than others. So if we look at those global CO2 emissions by sector, you'll see the bottom two here for industry and power generation make up most of that, right? And the potential abatement methods for these emissions are, include carbon capture and storage, or CCS. But even if you look at the other emissions, when we're talking about lower emission fuels, that's also when you can have BECCS come into play, which also has CCS. When we're talking about clean hydrogen, you know, there are many ways to make hydrogens, but one of those being what's famously called the blue hydrogen, which essentially you produce hydrogen, and the CO2 generated from that hydrogen production is then captured and stored. So this is just to show you how critical and how CCS can play a role in many of in the decarbonation of many of these industries. So this is going to show you, you know, what are the available abatement technologies for these hard to decarbonize applications, right? So if we're talking LNG or gas, industries that use gas as their main source of fuel. So what you can do, there are several ways, right? So for those that are using LNG for industry or power, essentially you can keep your whole facilities working as is, and then at the back end of it, you add a CCS plant to capture that CO2, and then transport and sequester it to a storage site underground. The other way you could decarbonize the facilities is by doing what we call a pre-combustion solution. So instead of bolting on a CCS plant at the back end of your plant, what you do is you switch your fuel from gas or gas made from LNG with hydrogen. And to make hydrogen, you take that gas and then you put it into a reformer, and you know, the CO2 you generate from making that hydrogen, you capture and sequester it, and then the hydrogen is then used for either power or transportation, and that excuse me, and that hydrogen process is essentially carbon free. And same thing here with ammonia, right? So hydrogen and ammonia can be interchangeable. The reason why some people prefers ammonia is basically ammonia is much easier to transport. So you still have the reforming to make hydrogen with CCS to sequester CO2, but then you convert that hydrogen into ammonia so that it's easier to transport. And then you can either use the ammonia directly in the industry or convert it back into hydrogen for then, you know, use as a hydrogen fuel. Excuse me. So this kind of shows you what are what's the trajectory of these different decarbonization pathways, right? But there are many scenarios as was shown in the first in the first page, right? But in any of those, you see CCS, hydrogen, and biofuels really taking off, especially after 2030, in 2030, as that demand for fossil fuels come down and more technologies are unlocked. So this is just to show that, you know, what that potential market size could be by 2050, and we think CCS could be a you know, a very big part of that, making up to up to $4 trillion. That's essentially almost, sorry, almost as big as the oil and gas industry as it is today. This is just to show the ExxonMobil opportunity pipeline in the low carbon, in our low carbon investment. The colors show you different, whether it's biofuels, emissions reduction related to our scope 1 or scope 2, and CCS and hydrogen. So it's just to show that we've got quite a bit in the pipeline coming up, because we believe in the future market of these low carbon solutions. Now going specifically into CCS, right? What exactly is it? So it's the capture. So what usually is the case is that you have a cluster of industries located within proximity. At least that's kind of the that's the preferred configuration, so that you can aggregate all these emissions and build one capture plant for these different emissions, right? So that's right here. You've got the CO2 capture and compression, and then from there, you either utilize the CO2 or you sequester it. When you sequester CO2, it can go either onshore or offshore, either to depleted oil and gas fields, or to what we call saline aquifers, which are more widely available throughout the world. However, usually the challenge there is that there's not a whole lot of data on them, so they're harder to find in that sense, because there isn't a lot of data. While we can already know the portfolio of oil and gas fields around the world right now, and essentially do a screening of these fields and find out which ones are best for CO2 sequestration. And here is a project that ExxonMobil is working on with a few 10 or 11 other companies. This is in the US Gulf Coast. The bubbles here are showing the emissions sources across the Gulf Coast, from Texas to Louisiana. And there are multiple CCS projects that are being considered along this coastline, right? There's this initial focus on high CO2 concentration sources, and I'll show you why in the next slide. But essentially, the drivers on this is that they have close proximity to quality onshore and offshore in the Gulf of Mexico underground storage for CO2. Of late in ExxonMobil, we're leveraging our existing capabilities in order to execute these projects. And with the recent expansion of the IRA with the 45Q incentives, it also provided a driver to demonstrate that we can do these large-scale emissions reductions in the United States. Okay, this one is showing from the NPC, the U.S. National Petroleum Council study on CCS economics. The costs here are highly dependent on, what's the CO2 concentration of of your emissions. If you have high CO2 concentrations, 95% and above, such as those that are typical in gas processing plants, in ammonia production, then that cost of capture can be contained to fairly low. With storage and transportation, maybe you'll get, up to around $100 per ton. If you're talking lower CO2 concentration, which is, more, which is most of the emissions around the world are lower CO2 concentration. So here we're talking the coal power generation, combined cycle power generation, cement, and steel. It's kind of in this in this range here. If you're talking direct air capture with very, very low CO2 concentration, it just goes to be really, really high. So that cost of capture really drive the overall value chain cost. Some of the policy enablers for CCS, we see kind of different policies, evolving at different pace. So in some places, they're focusing on grants and loans, such as Australia. In others, tax credits, as the US, or contract for difference, as in the UK. The other, and these can be, at the storage side or the emitter side, right? And then in terms of regulation, how will you actually operate these fields? You got to be able to access the pore space, right? Can you get equity in the pore space? And then along the value chain, from emitter all the way to storage, how do you allocate risks between all the different players, right, in the value chain, in the capture space, in the transport space, offloading and storage? And how does the long-term liability work? Can you hand it over to the government as the storage operator at some point in the future? In some countries, including Asia Pacific, the permits to do these CO2 transport and storage are still non-existent. Who's going to be the regulatory authority that regulates this? What kind of implementing regulations are needed? Who's going to issue them? All of that sometimes are still non-existent and will need to be put in place. This is just show you where some of the ExxonMobil CCS portfolio of opportunities are. So in Asia, we have China, which would be probably mostly a domestic CCS kind of play. Singapore could be a capture and aggregation kind of project, with Malaysia, Indonesia, probably likely focusing on the transport and storage part of the value chain. Gorgon and Gippsland, and in Gorgon, there's already an existing CCS project associated with the gas production there. And in Gippsland, we're also progressing a CCS project, with the first phase being tied to ExxonMobil-owned emissions. So from there, I think that is my last one. And we'll be happy to take questions in the Q&A later. Thank you.
Many thanks, Cindy. Very informative. I personally learned a lot in terms of the potential, some of the obstacles, and how how decarbonization and CCS reached the process. The last slide on the policy drivers, particularly interesting, and I'd like to get into that a little bit more during the discussion later. Thank you. Yona, my colleague at CIL, it's my pleasure to invite our next speaker, Yona Lyons, to really enlighten us with what is the international legal framework for offshore CCS. Yona is a visiting associate research professor at CIL, where she has led the marine environmental research work for ocean law and policy since 2009. And in parallel to that, she's also a trustee and chair of the Advisory Committee on the Protection of the Seas. Yona, over to you, please.
Thank you, Danielle. Is everything visible as it should be? Wonderful.
Yes, absolutely.
So thank you, Danielle, and good day or evening to all. So as a keen researcher and supporter of our work at CIL, we're certainly delighted to co-host this event on the hot topic of CCS and its place in urgent responses to climate change, especially in the context of the importance of oceans to the stability of our climate, our extreme dependence on marine ecosystems that sustain all aspects of our lives, and therefore, as a solution to climate change. We've been until now sort of talking about CCS going offshore, onshore, without making such much differences. And here now my role is to provide an overview of international law applicable to CCS in the subseabed and subsoil. So needless to say that we can only scratch the surface in the short time we have, and I will try to be brief to not eat into the Q&A, which can be the most important part of this type of event. So by way of background to this legal overview,
Yona, can you make it to full screen?
Yes, that's what I thought I had done. Is it now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, bear with me, I'm having some issue with the screen.
Would you like us to run the screens on the other end?
Okay, so
we can see your notes.
yeah, no, that's what but I don't know, things are misbehaving. That's what I usually do.
It happens.
Yeah, it does, unfortunately.
Yeah. Would you like? Would you like?
No, what I'm going to.
Would they be able to run the slides for you? Would that assist? I can see your full screen now. Actually, no problem if you're present with your screen.
Yes, but I have lost some of what I also need. But I think now I am fine. Okay, wonderful.
Perfect. All right.
Okay. So yes, so by way of background to this legal overview, I would like to start with 2 points. So first, the scope of the legal regulations I will focus on. So as you can see on this slide, carbon capture and sequestration can take many different forms Well, as we've said, it can take many different forms. It will start with carbon dioxide capture through extraction or removal. And as we have seen, it can occur in many different contexts. So as has been mentioned by the previous speaker, for example, carbon dioxide may be extracted from large industrial plants or from the exhaust pipes of vessels through scrubbers, which is quite a hot topic at the moment at the International Maritime Organization, so that it is not released into the atmosphere. And it can also be extracted from the atmosphere itself to lower the concentration of carbon dioxide. Unless captured carbon dioxide is reinjected on site, such as the way it can be done in oil and gas extraction, it will tend to be stored temporarily until the next step. So which is shown on this diagram. The next step is likely to involve some transport before it goes to either an industrial use or some other users, or to a grouping center before it gets injected into subsea bed formation. So, but this presentation focuses on the last step, which is the offloading and sequestration in the subsea bed. Which has less well understood. So I should say first that at each of these steps, there are different legal issues that arise, and there are rules of international law that would apply on each of these various steps. Here, we're going to focus specifically on the offshore context, and so the sequestration, offloading and sequestration into the subsea bed. So the second point I would like to make is to highlight, by way of background, the environmental risks that have to be considered to project how international regulation applies and understand the approach of international law, particularly the ocean law regime. So environmental risk from sequestered carbon dioxide are linked to scenarios that involve sudden or catastrophic escape or slow leakages of carbon dioxide from the reservoirs it has been sequestered in or injected in. At the minimum, such release would compromise the initial objective of removing the carbon dioxide, but it can also have serious adverse impacts that I would like to highlight. So in the marine environment, the behavior of the leaked carbon dioxide would depend on the type of release, the depth, pressure, the hydrodynamics of the surrounding environment. It could sit in a particular area for some times, but would be expected to dissipate over time. It would first trigger ocean acidification. It would also decrease the natural capacity of the ocean to absorb carbon dioxide. And when reaching the surface, it would release into the atmosphere. In the context of release into or before I get to the release to the atmosphere, yes, I would like to mention that there has been tests that showed that storing carbon dioxide underground can dissolve the minerals that help stop the gas from escaping. Carbon dioxide injected into saline aquifers in Texas have showed that sequestration made aquifer water more acidic, and this acidity attacked the surrounding rock formation, causing them to dissolve and thereby potentially allowing the gas to leak into the water table. The catastrophic impact of the sudden release into the atmosphere also needs mentioning here. There has been a disaster in Cameroon that exemplified this scenario. Overnight, nearly all living being was killed almost instantly, including insects. A carbon dioxide supersaturated layer that was sitting at the bottom of the lake was released by what have been a landslide or volcanic eruptions. The real circumstances are actually unconfirmed. All these point to the need and importance of rigorous site selection and monitoring, and sets the basis so to discuss the international regulation. So turning now to legal regulation and guidance provided by international law. We will first look at the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, our constitution for the ocean. UNCLOS applies to all activities at sea and imposes on states an obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. I will start with a number of general provisions that are applicable to the sequestration of carbon dioxide in subseabed formation where they are located. In addition to the general provision of Article 192, Article 195 is also very fitting, as it provides for the duty not to transfer damage or hazards or transform one type of pollution into another. In essence, a response to a pollution that creates a new pollution is not an acceptable pollution. Last of these general, but especially relevant general provisions are Article 204, 202, 206, which need highlighting because they provide for an obligation of states to assess potential effects of activities and to monitor the risks of pollution as well as publish reports. So let's now turn to a specific provision of the law of the sea, which is generally considered in the context of offshore oil and gas and offshore mining in general, but applies to seabed activities and therefore also to the injection of carbon dioxide in subseabed formation. Article 208 of UNCLOS provides that states shall adopt laws and regulations to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment arising from or in connection with seabed activities. It also says that such laws, regulation, and measures shall be no less effective than international rules, standards, and recommended practices and procedures. And it goes on adding that states acting, especially through competent international organizations or diplomatic conference, shall establish these standards and recommended practices and procedure. So finally, Article 214 reiterates the same in the context of the enforcement jurisdiction of states. So in a nutshell, what UNCLOS tells us is that states who have the duty to protect and preserve the marine environment must adopt regulations and measures that are no less effective than international rules, standards, and recommended practices and procedures that have been adopted through competent international organization or diplomatic conference. Well, the only intergovernmental body to have adopted specific rules, standards, and guidance for specifically subseabed carbon dioxide sequestration is the joint meeting of the state parties to the London Convention and its protocol. So let's turn now to this. The 1972 London Convention and its 1996 protocol regulate the dumping of waste and other matters at sea. Typical waste streams that have been, for example, the target of the work of these bodies have been nuclear waste, toxic substances that have been fully banned, or sewage sludges and dredging sludge that are regulated. But the 1972 London Convention did not include the placement of waste in the seabed within its scope, which means that carbon dioxide sequestration in that context would escape the scope of the London Convention. But by contrast, the London Protocol, which was adopted in 1996, does include the placement of waste in the water column, seabed, and subsoil within its scope. However, carbon dioxide was not a waste stream that was allowed under the London Protocol until it was amended in 2006. So the London Protocol came into force in 2006, and at its first meeting, decided to include, to allow for carbon dioxide as a waste stream on the basis that carbon dioxide capture and sequestration is one of a portfolio of options to reduce levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide capture and sequestration represents an important interim solutions. And in fact, it also refers in its decision to the report that Matthias mentioned of the IPCC from 2005. However, the resolution by which this amendment was adopted also states that carbon dioxide capture and sequestration should not be considered as a substitute to other measures to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Recognizing that not all countries have suitable subseabed geological formation for the sequestration of carbon dioxide streams, and that the London Protocol should not constitute a barrier to the transboundary movement of carbon dioxide streams to other countries for disposal, the 2009 amendment was adopted to allow the export of carbon dioxide streams for disposal. This amendment to the London Protocol must include confirmation and allocation of permitting responsibilities between the exporting and receiving countries. So under this new amendment, countries that decide to go for export of carbon dioxide for injection in subseabed formation have to conclude an agreement, and in this specific agreement, they need to agree on the terms for the issuance of the permit and the permit conditions. However, so this 2009 amendment has not entered into force. It requires a two-thirds acceptance by two-thirds of the parties. But in 2019, it was decided that because the London Protocol could not be a barrier and it was necessary and urgent for carbon dioxide, for CCS to occur, it was decided a fairly unusual thing by a process by the parties to the London Protocol. They decided to allow for the early entry into force of this amendment to make it possible for CCS, for transboundary CCS, for export of CCS to be possible under the London, two parties to the London Protocol. And according to, so there are 6 states that have made the decision to go for the early entry into force. So that's the provisional application, the second line that you have on this slide. There were already 10 states that had deposited their instruments of acceptance, but that's not sufficient to trigger the entry into force. So in the same context, the London Protocol, the parties to the London Protocol and the London Convention, because the way this body functions is that the parties meet together, it's a joint meeting of the parties for both. They have agreed in 2012 specific guidelines for the assessment of carbon dioxide for disposal into subseabed geological formation. And in these detailed guidelines, they, to just cite the headers of what can be found in those guidelines, you have carbon dioxide stream characterization, waste prevention audit, and consideration of waste management options, action lists and thresholds, identification and characterization of the subseabed geological formation and the surrounding environment, determination of potential impacts, the permit issuance procedure, project implementation and compliance monitoring, field monitoring, and a mitigation of remediation plan. So these are the fairly detailed guidelines which are under review and designed by states under the auspices of the London Convention, London Protocol, governing bodies and scientific committee and working groups, etc., which are applicable to the very questions that topic that we are discussing today. And that leads me to my last slides, which is that the situation is fairly complex. So the London Protocol has been ratified by 50 states. So we have 50 states that have that have adopted the London Protocol to date, but together the London Protocol plus the London Convention, that makes 100 parties. And so one of the questions when looking at the legal regimes and that applies to the placement of, so the injections of carbon dioxide into subseabed formation would be, is the exporting state a party to the London Convention or the London Protocol? And if it is a party to the London Protocol, then has it elected for early entry into force? Because otherwise, there's one situation where it's absolutely not allowed. It is for if it is a London Protocol party that has not acted, that has not declared that it wished to have an early entry into force, it is in a situation where it is not allowed to export carbon dioxide streams for injection into subseabed formation. So is carbon capture and storage import allowed in the importing states, and under what conditions? So there's a number of questions to be resolved that are not all quite clear cut. Who is responsible to conduct and bear the cost of the site selection procedures and monitoring? To what extent are the London Convention, London Protocol guidelines international standards? Some would say that the London Convention, London Protocol, there's one argument that would be that it is the adequate body and it is the only competent international organization that has adopted guidelines. So they could be considered from that perspective as standards by a competent body. On the other hand, can they really be considered as generally internationally accepted standards when only when not such a large number of states are in the room negotiating them? So can they apply to non-party states through UNCLOS? Because we've seen that there was a rule of reference in Article 208 of the Law of the Sea Convention. So that would invite the application, the consideration of those guidelines as standards, but can they really be considered as such? And who is responsible or liable for sequestered carbon dioxide if it was to escape is also a question that should not be left aside. And I'll stop here.
Many thanks, Juno, for guiding us through the various legal considerations, or rather the international legal framework, particularly to offshore carbon capture and storage. And that's particularly important because not every state, in fact, not many states, have access to their own onshore, offshore storage sites. And so the need for this international regime to be clear is critically important for many states. Singapore, for example, that would be quite important. So let's, with that very helpful overview, I'd like to now invite Ruth Hilda Sartre, I gave my pronunciation. She's the General Counsel of Northern Lights Project, really to speak to us on the Northern Lights Project as a case study and help us understand how these various considerations come together. Ruth, over to you, please.
Thank you, Danielle. I will start with bad news today, which is that I have a cold, just like Cindy, and I also have some IT issues. Hopefully, you are able to see my screen. Can you see my?
We can see that very well. We can see that very well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So I'm the general counsel of a company called Northern Lights, and I have been that since January this year. So quite new to this exciting company and exciting role. I'm glad to be here today. My ambition for the next 15 minutes is to share kind of practical legal experiences from our company, who is about to become operational. And the backdrop for Northern Lights is, as for CCS in general, it is the need for utilizing CCS technology if we are to reach net zero. Just one moment, and I'll try to move on in my presentation. Does it work okay? Yes, good.
Yeah.
So a little bit of what Northern Lights is. We are developing the world's first open source CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. So the ambition is to deliver carbon storage at scale as a commercial service. And to the left, you can see an overview picture of the receiving terminal of the Northern Lights. It is located at the west coast of Norway, just outside the city of Bergen. And the terminal is, as per we speak, about 60–70% completed, and it is to be ready in 2024. To the right, it's a zoom-in picture of the administration building at the terminal. And here is also a visitor center. And we receive quite a lot of visitors from all over the world, almost every week. So this illustration shows the CCS value chain, and everything within the purple box is the scope of Northern Lights. So our customers to the right here, they capture CO2 at their plants. The CO2 is turned into liquid and then temporarily stored before, and now we are within the purple box. It is transported by ship to the receiving terminal, which you saw in the past slide. And at the terminal, the CO2 is temporarily stored onshore in tanks before it is transported by pipeline offshore and then injected into a saline aquifer for permanent storage at 2,600 meters below sea level. So Northern Lights is a partnership between 3 companies, namely Equinor, Shell and Total Energies. But Northern Lights is also part of the Norwegian government's project called Longship. And this project has the ambition to develop a full-scale CCS value chain in Norway by 2024. And the rationale behind it is to provide realistic decarbonization opportunity for European industries. And the first phase of Northern Lights operations will accommodate the transport and storage needs for those customers also being a part of this Longship project. And that is Norcem, a cement factory in Norway, and it is also Celsio, a waste-to-energy facility also located in Norway, close to Oslo. However, the ambition of Northern Lights, it goes beyond being part of this state Longship project, and that is to establish a commercially sustainable transport and storage service for CO2. And we are actively working across Europe to sign more customers and to expand. So I think when we talk about the legal implications of our project, that is also closely related to the CCS market context at this stage. The market potential for Northern Lights is vast when you think of the magnitude of emissions from hard-to-abate industries in Europe, which you can see on the illustration here. But still, it is so that it is cheaper to emit to atmosphere than to store CO2. And currently, no established market is in place for CCS. There are no other open source carbon storages available to European emitters apart from the Northern Lights project. And further, establishing a facility like Northern Lights is very capital intensive, and the same is the case for carbon capturing, also very capital intensive. So we receive state funding, and also our first customers, they also receive state subsidies. So in such new commercial environment, there are some legal challenges. First of all, commercial contracts with customers needs to be established for the first time. We have no templates, model contracts, or industry standards in place. And secondly, you have the element of cross-border transportation of CO2, which Jona just talked about. And we have the London Protocol, and we have to have in place bilateral agreements between the states involved before we can transport cross-border CO2. Further, also linked to the market and a legal implication is the EU regulatory framework for the ETS price. It's very important to us because this will gradually make it cheaper for our customers to store CO2 instead of emitting CO2 to the atmosphere. That was a little bit legal implications in respect of the market, but we are also facing some challenges in relation to the regulatory framework. The legal point of departure for us is the Norwegian state sovereignty over the Norwegian continental shelf. That means that carbon storage is subject to a permitting regime, and this permitting regime is part of a wider regulatory framework that is in place for CCS. The framework in place is extensive, I would say. It is also somewhat fragmented and to a certain extent also a little bit duplicated. I think it's fair to sum up that it's fairly complex. One aspect of this is also that we have to relate to a wide range of different public bodies or stakeholders, if you like, in terms of reporting requirements, inspections, and other control mechanisms. The regulatory framework is based on EU law, and it is also inspired by oil and gas industry regulations. And the latter has, of course, served Norway very well for decades, and therefore there is a good rationale behind the inspiration from this industry when it comes to regulation. But at the same time, there are significant differences between the two industries, which means that not all of the oil and gas regulation is fit for purpose. And one topic which can serve as an example here is the HSE regulation. In oil and gas, you have hydrocarbons under pressure, which has the potential of causing major accidents. And the same is not the case for CCS, but still the CCS HSE regulation is based on the same regulation as for oil and gas, and the regulation is also partly interlinked. However, this important difference between the industries needs to be reflected both in the regulation and also when the regulations are being used by the authorities. Another important aspect of the regulatory regime is that it hasn't been tested before. So Northern Lights is a first also in this respect. We have no rulings, practice, or even much legal theory to go to for advice. And last but not least, regulatory requirements are established, but it remains to be seen what they really entail. And I would like to speak on a few examples for illustrating this issue. And one is that we have, within our regulatory framework for CCS, we have a provision that is widely used in oil and gas, and that is a requirement for third-party access to storage infrastructure and facilities. As a provider of CO2 storage, the state may impose on us an obligation to accommodate a request for such third party. but it remains to be seen on what terms and in which situation this regulation will come into play. Another examples are requirements that we have for a financial guarantee before we can start up. And there is also a requirement for financial contribution before liability for a closed down storage facility is handed over to the state. So it remains to be seen the actual content of these requirements. I will say a little bit about our state support agreement. We are receiving funds from the state, and therefore there is a state support agreement in place. There are also similar agreements in place between the state and the two first customers utilizing the Northern Lights facilities, the Norcem cement factory and Celsius, which I just mentioned. And that means, and that this is kind of special in a way, it means that Northern Lights, we don't have a relationship with our first customers. We only have a contractual relationship with the state. And the same goes for Norcem and Celsius. What I can say about our state support agreement is that it is a comprehensive document, and it sets out a wide range of obligations that we have to comply with. For example, on governance, we have obligations for sharing our learnings and experiences from the project. We have obligation in terms of procurement, in terms of the relationship that we have to our technical service providers, and also how to separate between costs that are eligible for state funding and other costs. The picture you see on the slide, that is of the Norwegian lawyer Sondre Dyrland receiving an award from the Financial Times for his team's work on the Longship project, and particularly the legal work on these state support agreements. So this slide, it just sets out some examples of more general requirements for Northern Lights in respect of the state support agreement for illustration purposes, really. But what is important is that if we are not in compliance with these requirements, this is considered a default and may potentially result in loss of financial support for our project. What I can share from the negotiations of this agreement is that it was very important not only to have commercial legal participants in the negotiations. Technical disciplines were vital also for these negotiations and to make a very good framework for us. We had to take some alternative approaches and solutions, considering that it is the taxpayers' money at stake when negotiating this agreement. What has also been very useful is that the agreement has annexes with calculations and examples of how to do things, and that is very helpful in our work now. A last point is that this agreement needs to comply with state aid guidelines. So we had an approval of the agreement from the EFTA Surveillance Authority, ESA. So I have 2 slides left, and both of them are legal challenges, at least partly in respect of competition law. Northern Lights is owned by the Equinor, Total Energies and Shell, as I mentioned, and all of these, they have their own CCS projects as well, apart from Northern Lights. At the same time, as owners, they have a legitimate need for information in their capacity as owners, but there are at the same time legal restrictions and boundaries for sharing of information. especially within the area of competition law. But it can also be like confidentiality clauses. So that is something that we always have to be mindful of. So on the one hand, we are towards the state obliged to share our experiences, information and learnings from the project. And on the other hand, we also need to be mindful of what we can't share and with whom. So that's a legal challenge. The last thing I would like to mention is the EU merger clearance. Our owners, they are all large industrial actors with significant worldwide activities, and they also either have their seats or principal fields of activity in EU or a significant turnover within the EU. And that means that they are subject to the EU merger regulation. And this regulation prohibits mergers and acquisitions, which would significantly reduce competition in the single market. For example, if they would create dominant companies. And this creation of Northern Lights is reckoned as a so-called concentration within an EU dimension. And that means that it needs to be notified to the EU Commission and also to obtain merger clearance. And that is at the moment an ongoing process where we have to give a lot of information about our activities to the Commission. So that was a little bit about our activities in the Northern Lights and the related legal implications. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and really thank you all for panelists for very fascinating conversation on each of the 4 elements. Now, we've got a bit of extended time here to really get into, I hope, in the discussion on this very interesting topic. So maybe if I can just start with the legal perspective first, and maybe if I could direct a question to you, Yona, maybe setting this off, offshore carbon capture and storage, transboundary transport is a key question. You've raised all the risk. The question I have is this, I mean, we've talked about the UNCLOS, you've talked about the London Protocol, the London Convention. Are there any other applicable international principles that may be applicable? How would you, factor in the balance, between the benefits and the risk? As you have mentioned, there are lots of risks that are unknown, but there's also benefits. How do we balance that? How do we apply the principles to that? The related question I have is this. I mean, you've talked about the uncertainty and the really need to grapple with the relationship as to who and how can actually export. The question here is, of course, not everyone is a party to the London Protocol, but the conversation is so important to the larger membership of UNCLOS. Is there a conversation taking place? Are states engaging in that process? And where are they engaging in that process? If you're not a party to the London Protocol, how can you influence that discussion? Maybe I'll start with you, Yona.
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, they're not straightforward questions. Okay, so other principles, they are general principles. I mean, we could go back to the precautionary approach, and there's other guiding principles that we can look into. Really, what it boils down to is, as always, the devil is in the details, and it'll be the carbon accounting and the security of the site selection process and the scrutiny that's applied, and the work that's done ahead to ensure that it is the right reservoir that is selected, is what is going to be the only way to decrease the risk. I think that's just, and that's where the projects, which are ahead. I mean, Northern Line project, the one in Australia, and other researchers working on it. That's what they're trying to get to is assess the extent of the risk and how to limit that risk. And then what the regulations are doing is trying to make sure that whoever's acting in that field is going to apply the scrutiny that's required in order to avoid a catastrophe that could happen if it was not done properly. So it is a very serious business. It's really important. to be able to resort to CCS, I believe. I mean, the figures that are provided by those who study climate change are, they're quite certain about it. So it seems that it is a necessary route, but it's also a route that is fraught with a certain amount of risk, and it's only studying it that can limit the risk. So, and that's why the London Protocol and the guidelines that are developed there are useful on that path. And that goes to your second question, is this, where are those discussions occurring? I think it's fairly early days for these discussions at international level. I mean, the IPCC report on CCS is from 2005. This is when the idea started. But since then, I personally am only aware, and I've only participated to discussions at the London Convention, London Protocol. Now, it's a very open forum, so all states who want to be there can be there, even if they're not party. Observers, the way it is happening, observers can be, a state can be an observer, even if not a party. So maybe there will be, through the carbon accounting work and the implementation of the Paris Agreement discussion, maybe that will be another forum where, through the devising of methodologies, there will be a new discussion that hopefully will communicate with the previous one under the London Convention, London Protocol, to not lose the hard work of some states that have been pushing it, including Norway. But yes, I think that's what I would say for now. I don't know if that answers sufficiently your question.
No, thanks, Yolanda. So a follow-up question. I mean, you said the forum is actually very open, anyone can participate. How many in your view, is there enough participation by non-parties in the London Protocol, in the discussion thus far, given the importance of the topic? Because I wonder whether some may consider it to be an incentive not to be, not to be a party, if being a party prevents you from engaging these activities. So just yes, sense it's not enough conversation.
No, there's not enough conversation, and there are not enough states that are non-parties. I think states are a bit overwhelmed with the number of meetings that occur in parallel, and there's also a legitimate, question, which is it the right forum? Because the initial idea was, because it's also the forum that has been handling ocean fertilization, for instance, so it has a lot of issues that are part of the climate change discussion. But unlike the Law of the Sea, it has regular active meetings, and it has a scientific committee also. So they do deal with all of these questions, and they invite experts who contribute to IPCC reports and who are doing research. So it's a very serious body from that perspective. But the fact that non-party states are not part of the discussion is absolutely an issue. I share your view.
Thanks. If that, maybe I can turn to Matthias. What then is the correct forum? What would be the right forum? Is the climate change, where the participants tend to be climate scientists, climate policy advisors? Is there enough expertise if this conversation takes place there, whether within the context of the Article 6 rules, and we talk about the MRV, or even the Oceans Dialogue under the UNFCCC, where this is clearly also going to be an issue? Over to you, Matthias. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. Excellent question. So I do think when it comes to, the climate effect, the carbon accounting, the ensuring that what is claimed to have happened has actually happened in terms of storing CO2, I think that is where, where the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement offers these sort of broad structures that are required to track and to do that tracking consistently. But I do think in terms of actually implementing that, there is still a very large gap. And this is mainly due to the lack of practice, right? I mean, we heard extensively about the permitting process, and already at that level, in that relationship between a private company that is actually doing this and the state within which this is done, that relationship is already a relatively complex one, and it needs to operationalize the rules and the provisions that the state itself has to comply with in terms of then communicating to the international community, for example, through the greenhouse gas inventories. And so that needs to sort of consistently link up from this actual implementation stage to the national and then the international stage. And I think in that sort of communication, there are still some gaps, some misunderstandings, and largely because it's not been done sufficiently for those processes to really work effectively. And I think we all look to Norway as the one place where this is actually really done, and really it looks like it done and approached in a very consistent manner. But even there, like when we look at international cooperation, there are still open questions, I believe, where that if there are two countries that want to cooperate, be it, you have CO2 captured in one country and then stored in Norway, I believe there are still some uncertainties or ambiguities as to who gets to claim the result ultimately. I mean, domestically, this is clear when we look at the sectoral reporting of the stored CO2. This is an emissions reduction in the sector in which the CO2 was captured. But when you have this with an international component, there are different understandings out there as to who gets to actually declare that result in their national greenhouse gas inventory. And so this is a pretty fundamental challenge, and just an example for, I think, perhaps the tip of the iceberg of potential misunderstandings where really we need to work through that cooperatively at this point quite rapidly.
Thanks, Matthias. A very, very important point, because I was looking through the questions that's been raised as well. And the question is, how do we link this as well? The question of the national inventory, countries, the different methodologies, is moving towards harmonization. The CC, the Plus initiative that you mentioned, is that a move towards harmonization? And that question was posed. Another question related to that is really this question of, is there a certificate of origin type requirement? Again, somewhat linked to your question, because how do you trace, how do you avoid duplication, double counting, who has the right to claim that? Those are all very practical questions. And I wonder if I could turn that to maybe Ruth or to Cindy. Maybe you'd like to address that question on what is lacking in that. From your perspective, we talked about international regulation, the international regime, Rona has talked about that. But I think Ruth and Cindy's presentation also referred very much to the fragmentation at domestic and regional level. And how do we deal with that question? I mean, for an industry partner like ExxonMobil, the predictability is important. So what would be most important from your perspective in terms of that kind of domestic regional regime in terms of clarity? And Ruth as well, perhaps both legal and policy, what would be the key issues? Cindy, would you like to start us off?
Sure, Danielle. So really from the regulatory and policy side, we see it as three key levers that we would like to see, right? So firstly is around the enabling regulations that would allow you to build these CCS projects. Just from, access to pore space point of view, is there a licensing process that applies? How can companies, come in and get an equity position in some of these areas? In Australia, for instance, there is an existing process for GHG blocks. There isn't such regulatory framework in Malaysia or Indonesia, for instance, right? So that's kind of firstly the enabling regulation for CCS, and then the second one is around policy support, right? We see all these CCS projects around the world happening in places where there are policy supports in its various forms, right? Whether it's in the US, Australia, in parts of the Europe, right? And because it is so critical with the space being so nascent, and costs are, quite honestly still high. Other than voluntary, the industry does need incentives from the governments in order to activate some of these projects. And the third one is what's been talked about largely here in this webinar is around cross-border, right? Obviously, the Northern Lights have made it possible. Now, how could that translate into the other countries looking to establish such similar arrangements? And this is particularly important in Asia Pacific, right? Because we see countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, with the geological storage for CO2. These are places that, don't really have the policy support to incentivize its domestic emitters to decarbonize, right? While other places in Asia Pacific, and such as in Japan, South Korea, that do have kind of the ability, monetary wise, to support the activation of some of these projects through the full value chain, they don't have the geological storage needed for CCS. So just from that perspective, it's clear that there needs to be a solution between these different countries to at least strike bilaterally in order to make some of these work.
Thanks, Cindy. I think to the extent that there are guiding or some guidance, I think we're at the stage where it seems quite nascent. Countries are kind of grappling what to do with that, and on so many levels, international, the state-to-state agreements, and the state-to-industry sort of partnership. Ruth, may I turn to you now in terms of the same issue? Maybe you can address it on the policy of the legal aspect. How do all these different laws, you talk about competition law, there's liability, there's insurance, how do they all come together in a project like?
Well, I think that from my part of the world, or from Europe, we see that regulation is key to solve this problem of accounting and who should have the liability or the benefit for CO2 being stored. And you see now with this ETS price from the EU, and they have amended it, so it will be gradually stricter towards 2030, which is very positive for CCS in Europe, because it will make it much more commercially viable for the industry to actually store the CCS, the CO2, sorry. And also this carbon border adjustment mechanism is important into that picture. So regulation is definitely key. Yeah, what else can I say? I don't know if you've heard about this e-liability accounting from the Oxford University, but it just came to mind that using some kind of that kind of methodology is maybe the way we need to go, both in terms of the Scope 3 discussion, but also for CO2 capture and storage. So regulation, the legal is very important. Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks very much. I'm aware we're running out of time, but I'd like to, before I end this very interesting discussion, one last question to each of the panelists to maybe answer in 1 minute. What is your wish list? All right, one wish. What in terms of maybe the most important priority item in your view, whether it's legal, policy, operational, technical? What is the most important priority in your view? We'll start maybe with Matthias. For the government policymakers who are engaging in this area.
Yeah, so exactly. I think my wish is to mostly decision makers to really get going and to work with all the actors in the space to act with the urgency that we have before us, essentially.
Yes, thanks very much, Matthias. Urgency seems to be key, but what I'm hearing is that everything takes time and there's not quite enough conversation and not quite enough time. So there seems to be a disjunct between the priorities. Fiona, what about you?
I would agree with this first wish, but I would probably add to it to ensure that policy people get involved also with the scientific aspects of. So there's the technical aspects of the of wanting to sequester a certain amount of, as much as we can, of carbon dioxide, and this is a really present need. Now, there's also another really important thing, which is to make sure to not create something worse by trying to fix a problem. And for that, it requires to look at in the face what the adverse consequences can be, and deal with the relevant. So which means that the engineers, together with the marine scientists with respect to offshore, I mean, one of the questions is, why would we so much need to go offshore, and why can't we do it onshore? Because monitoring onshore is much easier than offshore. But it seems that the social license is much greater offshore because, you know, it's far away from site. So, but it's not the fact that it's the social license that would push it is not a very good reason, really, because what we're trying to do is get rid of is store away securely a certain amount of carbon. So ensuring that the right people are in the room, enough of the right people are in the room, is easier said than done, but it's critical.
Thanks, Jenna. I think this social, license that you mentioned is very important. We're in a climate now where there's a lot of environmental litigation. And because of so much uncertainty associated with the risk, the question is whether, even measures to do on-site offshore are likely in themselves to attract environmental litigation of some sort, or public interest litigation of some sort, that end up chilling the development. So it's an important balance we need to bear in mind. Cindy, over to you, and then Ruth, we can close us up.
I'm sorry, Danielle, is it like a closing remark or?
Oh no, the priority in your field, yeah.
The priority.
Wish list. Yes, the one wish list for government policy decision makers in this area to move forward the development of CCS. Right.
I think the first step is to gain clarity over, who is driving this in the government, right? I think in several countries there's some confusion as to, is this under, the energy, mineral resources type of jurisdiction? Is it under Ministry of Environment? Because it's important to know, to have that clarity from the government, so that the industry knows who to work with to drive, who's going to be the champion for all of these, because it will likely require kind of cross government institutions type of collaboration, and having that one champion institution within the government for the industry to work with would be I think a good first step for at least a few countries in Asia Pacific.
Great, Cindy. Very, very, very helpful. Ruth?
Yes, again, from a Norwegian perspective, I think that the technical challenges has proven manageable for CCS. It's more about the commercial and the regulatory challenges that remains to be proven, and that we have a commercial way ahead of us. So my only wish, or my first top priority wish, would be for the ETS price to go up.
Thank you to end us on that note. And it remains for me really again to thank everyone for this really insightful conversation. We always run out of time. Probably warrant another session all by itself to delve into this. Can I also commend everyone to have a look at the questions that have been posed? Panelists, thank you very much for answering those questions, and I would recommend everyone have a look at those. Some of them have been weaved into the Q&A moderation, but please do have a look at those as well. So with that, again, thank you very much to everyone, to our panelists, and to all who have listened in. Daewon, any parting words? If not, then I would say thank you very much, and good day, good night, good evening. and hope to see everyone in person again very soon.